During World War II, Japan seemed unstoppable. Its navy ruled the Pacific, and the Emperor's orders were transmitted through ciphers no one could break. American ships sank, planes fell, and hope faded. The enemy seemed to know every move. But in a sealed building near Washington, a group of scientists decided to challenge the invisible empire. They created something that changed the course of the war, a machine that could read the enemy's secrets. This is the story of a project the Japanese would call impossible, and the Americans simply called magic. In the late 1930s, the Pacific Ocean was turning into a chessboard. On one side, the United States, building aircraft carriers and fortifying Hawaii. On the other, the Japanese Empire, whose ships were already stationed off the coast of China. The war hadn't begun yet, but the air was thick with anticipation. Diplomats smiled, but behind those smiles were telegrams no one could read. The Japanese had created a new communication system, the cipher machine Purple. It was meant to replace the older, less reliable Red system. Purple encrypted Tokyo's diplomatic correspondence with embassies and consulates around the world. Each character passed through a complex network of electrical switches, relays, and commutators. The output was a stream of letters that appeared random even to the world's best mathematicians. American intelligence intercepted these messages, but decoding them was impossible. Radio stations picked up signals, decoding tapes filled pages with incomprehensible symbols, and all of it was archived until ideas emerged. That's when the Signal Intelligence Service, the U.S. Army's Radio Intelligence Unit, abbreviated SIS, stepped onto the stage. It was founded by the brilliant cryptographer William Friedman, a man who saw patterns in ciphers, not chaos. By that time, Friedman was already considered a legend in his field. During World War I, he worked on American encryption systems, and in the interwar period, he led an entire school of analysts. His approach was almost scientific. He applied mathematics, statistics, and linguistics to search for patterns even where there seemed to be nothing but random letters. In 1939, Friedman was given a task that most specialists would have refused: to break Purple without access to the machine itself. Not a single blueprint, not a single spy, not a single internal contact in the Japanese embassy, only radio intercepts and the belief that human logic always leaves traces in its creations. The team he assembled was small, just a few dozen people. Among them were mathematicians, engineers, linguists, early programmers, before computers existed, many of whom didn't even hold military ranks. They worked in a modest building on the outskirts of Washington, without air conditioning, surrounded by humming transformers and paper tapes. At that time, the U.S. was not yet involved in the war. Europe was already ablaze. Hitler was advancing, but Washington lived in an atmosphere of isolationism. Nevertheless, tension was felt within the intelligence community. Everyone understood. If Japan decided to attack, the first weapon wouldn't be a cannon. It would be a radio signal. Purple was a mystery. Every morning, SIS received new telegrams, only partially decrypted. Dates, names, random phrases, fragments of diplomatic messages. Friedman sat over them for hours, searching for repetitions, rhythms, statistical coincidences. He was convinced that the machine, no matter how complex, still followed a certain logic. And yet, nothing was coming together. The Americans didn't even know how Purple was constructed. Everyone assumed it was similar to the German Enigma, but there was no concrete data. The problem was that the Japanese, unlike the Germans, weren't encrypting military orders, but diplomatic texts, which meant the messages looked natural. Phrases like "coordinate with the ministry" or "awaiting response to the note" offered no clues to reconstruct the machine's logic. In the fall of 1939, Friedman wrote in his work journal, "Purple is not just a cipher. It's an expression of foreign thinking. To understand it, one must think like the Japanese." Thus began a cryptographic duel that newspapers didn't write about and no films were made about. While explosions thundered over Europe in the basement of a modest building in northwest Washington, a handful of people quietly listened to radio static and drew diagrams on graph paper. They didn't yet know that in 2 years their work would change the course of the war in the Pacific. For now, it was just a puzzle, too complex to walk away from. If William Friedman hadn't become a cryptographer, he would likely have become a poet. His notes included phrases like, "Codes are the language of secrets, and a cipher is a rhythm you can hear if you listen to silence long enough." But instead of writing poems, he wrote formulas. Instead of rhymes, he searched for symbol repetitions. And that's precisely what made him one of the most unusual scientists of his time. He was born in 1891 in Russia, into a family of emigrants who fled the pogroms. His real name was Wolf Friedman. In the United States, he received his education at Cornell University, studying plant genetics, but soon became fascinated by mathematics and linguistics. Fate led him to a completely unexpected place, the laboratory of eccentric millionaire Elizabeth Gallup, who was trying to prove that Shakespeare's plays were actually written by Francis Bacon. It was there that Friedman first encountered the idea of cipher, analyzing texts and hidden patterns. From a literary game emerged the profession of his life. During World War I, he worked in the Army's cryptographic department and quickly became an authority. He understood a cipher is not just a way to protect information, it's a form of thinking. Every nation encrypts in its own way, and to break a foreign code, one must enter the logic of a foreign culture. By the 1930s, Friedman had become head of the Signal Intelligence Service, a small department created within the U.S. Army. He gathered around him people who would hardly have been accepted in other agencies: young mathematicians with no experience, enthusiastic engineers, women with philological backgrounds who could spot repetitions in long texts. The team was jokingly called Friedman's Orchestra, because he truly conducted them like a maestro, with precision, but also with faith in intuition. Unlike many military leaders, he didn't raise his voice or demand reports every 10 minutes. He would simply sit down next to someone and ask, "What if this symbol isn't a letter but a pause?" Or, "What if the Japanese aren't encrypting but drawing?" For Friedman, ciphers weren't just a set of signs. They were reflections of human logic. He knew even the most sophisticated mechanism is created by human hands, and therefore, somewhere within it must be a flaw, a repetition, a vulnerability. In this, he resembled an investigator not searching for a criminal, but for the fingerprint of a thought. In early 1940, SIS received its first stable intercepts of messages encrypted by the Purple machine. Friedman began with the basics: statistical analysis. He compared symbol frequencies, message lengths, the probability of repetitions. It turned out that despite seeming randomness, certain symbol combinations appeared more often. This meant that inside the machine were repeating patterns, cycles that could be calculated. But that wasn't enough. Purple didn't just rearrange letters like the German Enigma. It used an electromechanical commutator that created tens of thousands of possible connections. Without access to the physical device, the Americans were working literally blind. Every day, the SIS team filled hundreds of pages with calculations. Sometimes they spent entire nights analyzing a single telegram 200 characters long. Progress was slow. William Friedman didn't hide his fatigue, but he never allowed anyone to give up. He often repeated a phrase that became their unofficial motto: "Machines don't think, but the people who build them do. We must find their logic." Gradually, a portrait of the machine began to take shape. Engineers hypothesized that Purple used 3 groups of relays, each responsible for transforming 1/3 of the alphabet. This discovery became the first real step toward understanding how it worked. At the same time, psychological tension in the department was growing. Work continued without weekends. No one knew how long this battle would last. Weeks, months, years. Friedman began losing sleep, complained of headaches and insomnia. In his notes from that time, one finds lines like, "They are invisible. We are fighting a ghost made of electricity." Meanwhile, outside the lab, the world was already changing. Europe was burning. Germany was seizing country after country. In the US, people still hoped to stay out of it, but talk of Japan grew louder. In one of the telegrams intercepted by SIS, the Japanese ambassador in Berlin wrote of the inevitability of conflict between Tokyo and Washington. No one then realized how soon those words would become prophetic. Friedman felt that time was running out. He gathered his team and said, "We cannot allow the enemy's first attack to catch us with an unbroken code." From that moment on, the work on Purple turned from an academic challenge into a real race. A race where the opponent was not a person, but an idea. Spring 1940. Washington lived its ordinary life. Parks full of people, newspapers writing about Europe, but no one yet sensed the approaching catastrophe. And in a small building at Arlington Hall, transformers hummed quietly, and above every desk hung its own paper storm. Kilometers of intercepted Japanese telegrams. They looked like meaningless strings of symbols. QHY ZTR gag machine chaos. Not a single familiar word, not a hint of order. William Friedman's team called these texts the Wall, indestructible, cold, and perfect. Dozens of analysts have been trying for months to find a pattern. They compared repeating groups of symbols, searched for matches between old and new messages, built frequency diagrams, and all of it to no avail. Purple resisted. It seemed to mock the people, changing keys daily, confusing the trail, and destroying all hope. Sometimes it felt like success was near. One day, engineer Frank Rowe noticed that certain symbols repeated more often when a message exceeded 500 characters. He hypothesized that inside Purple there was some division into channels, each processing its own part of the alphabet. This guess became the first glimmer of light. If they could determine how these channels were connected, they could reconstruct the machine's operating principle. But then a new problem arose. The Americans didn't have the actual machine. All calculations had to be done blind. They didn't know whether Purple looked like a keyboard, a set of switches, or a telephone exchange. All they had was a stream of signals and endless tables. Friedman wrote in a report, "We stand before a wall built of letters. Each letter, a brick, each combination, a labyrinth. To pass through it, we must not break it, but listen." He believed that ciphers sing. that every machine has a rhythm, barely audible but repeating. Some colleagues laughed at this, but only until Friedman showed his calculations. On the graphs, periodic oscillations did appear, symbols in certain positions repeated at intervals of exactly 25. That meant somewhere inside the machine, 25 contacts were rotating. It was a major breakthrough. Gradually, diagrams began to appear on the boards. At first simple, then increasingly complex, with circles, arrows, and numbers. They resembled electrical circuit diagrams, though no one on the team had seen a single wire. Mathematicians began to build a model of purple from imagination. But the deeper they went, the greater the tension became. People began to burn out. Friedman slept 3 to 4 hours a night, lived on coffee and sandwiches. One day, his assistant recalled, he stood at the board with chalk in hand and suddenly said, "It won't open. Purple was made to drive us mad." Then he just sat down and was silent for a long time. In the spring of 1940, he suffered a nervous breakdown. Doctors insisted on rest. He spent several weeks in a hospital, away from work. But even there, he continued writing formulas on napkins. While Friedman recovered, the team was led by his student, Frank Rowe, a man with an engineer's mindset. He wasn't a genius in mathematics, but he had practical thinking. Rowe proposed a revolutionary idea. If they couldn't see purple, they should build a copy? Not a guess, not a theory. A real electromechanical machine that would produce the same symbols? It sounded insane. They didn't know how the original was built, but Rowe was convinced. If they tested hypotheses daily and compared results with actual intercepts, they could gradually feel out the correct scheme. When Friedman learned of this, he supported the idea. He returned to the lab, gaunt but with the old spark in his eyes. "If purple can't be broken," he said, "then we'll build our own and make it speak." Thus began the most ambitious experiment in American cryptography, the creation of a mirror of the Japanese cipher machine. Parts, wires, and relays appeared on the tables. A machine that had never existed in the US began to be born from the sounds of clicks and paper. From that moment, the story shifted from analysis to an engineering feat. They weren't just solving a code, they were assembling a mind from copper and electricity. Summer 1940. In the basement of Arlington Hall, the air was thick with the smell of hot metal and heated insulation. Where once there had been the quiet of paper and pencil, now there was the hum of relays, the crackle of soldering, and the pounding of hammers. On a long wooden table under the glow of a lamp, something was being born. Something no one could call anything but a ghost machine. It wasn't built from blueprints, but from guesses. Not from spy photographs, but from logic. The Americans were building a copy of the Japanese purple machine, having never seen the original. The team was led by engineer Frank Rowe, a man who spoke to metal as if it were a living being. He could stand over a circuit for hours, listening to the clicks of contacts, and suddenly say, "Hear that? This relay is responding incorrectly, which means the circuit is miswired." For him, this wasn't just a project, it was a challenge. Friedman, having returned from the hospital, no longer led directly. He observed, helped with the math, but now Rowe was the driving force. He gathered a small group of engineers and mechanics around him. Boxes of coils appeared on the tables, wires, panels with sockets. They were assembling an electromechanical commutator in which each letter passed through 3 stages of transformation. The main hypothesis was this: the Japanese purple machine divided the alphabet into 3 parts: possibly 8, 8, and 10 characters. Each group passed through its own separate path inside the machine. The Americans called them banks. Each bank was controlled by its own set of relays, which shifted according to a specific cycle. This created the constant change in the cipher. Work progressed slowly. Sometimes weeks passed without results. Relays sparked, contacts overheated, wires tangled. But step by step, the construction grew more complex and closer to the solution. The first tests began in August. The machine built by Rowe occupied an entire table. It was clunky, clattered with every key press, but it looked alive. When the operator typed an English letter, another, encrypted, appeared on the tape a moment later. Friedman sat nearby, watching the miracle unfold. "We don't know if it works like Purple," he said, "but if it produces the same ciphers, that's already a victory." To test the hypothesis, the team took an intercepted Japanese message and tried running it through their machine with various settings. Days turned into nights. Paper tapes covered the floor. At first, the result was chaos, letters that didn't form words. But at one point, the operator stopped and said, "Wait, this looks familiar." Fragments of words could be read on the tape. Tokyo? Embassy? Washington? The room froze. They couldn't believe it. For the first time, the American machine had reproduced the Japanese code. Friedman stepped forward, took the tape in his hands, and stared at it for a long time. "It's not a perfect match," he said quietly, "but it's the right direction." The following weeks were like a marathon. The team fine-tuned the settings, adjusted the circuits, until one day in October 1940, the moment they had all been working toward arrived. The operator entered another message, and the output revealed a phrase that could be read effortlessly. "I report on a conversation with the German representative." They had done it. The ghost machine spoke. Now the Americans could read Japanese diplomatic messages, not instantly, but with enough accuracy for analysis. Purple had been broken, without a single spy, without blueprints, without infiltrating embassies. Only the power of logic and engineering stubbornness. But victory came with a shadow. When they began reading the decrypted telegrams, it became clear. The Japanese were preparing something big. The messages mentioned new directives for ambassadors, transmission of ciphers, strange instructions for observing American ports. Friedman understood. A storm was approaching. He gathered the team and said, "We've opened a window, and now we must look through it, even if we don't like the view." From that moment on, American intelligence gained continuous access to Tokyo's diplomatic communications. And although the military codes remained out of reach, Purple provided insight into Japan's political intentions. It marked the beginning of a new era in intelligence, one where battles were won not with cannons, but with information. By early 1941, the ghost machine at Arlington Hall was no longer just an experiment. It had become a window into the mind of Japan. Every day, Friedman's department received dozens of intercepted messages, and the team methodically transformed them from chaotic strings of letters into coherent phrases. The tone of diplomatic correspondence was changing. Where once Japanese telegrams were filled with polite formalities, requesting coordination, awaiting confirmation, now they carried a note of caution. Increasingly, they mentioned possible complications, strategic reorientation, and cryptic phrases like, "The interests of the empire require decisive measures before the end of the year." The Americans didn't know what lay behind these words, but they felt a growing sense of unease. With each passing month, the department's work expanded. Their machine now reproduced purple codes with such precision that the U.S. Army's Cryptographic Bureau created an entire division dedicated to decoding Japanese diplomatic mail. The project was given the codename Magic. Ironically, the word chosen for secrecy turned out to be eerily accurate. The decrypted texts truly resembled sorcery. They revealed things hidden even from politicians. Each morning, analysts delivered brief summaries, excerpts from Japanese dispatches. The embassy in Berlin is instructed to clarify Germany's position on U.S.-Japanese relations. The ministry requests a description of the location of American ships in Pearl Harbor. The phrase, "location of ships," drew attention. Why would diplomats be interested in the layout of Hawaii's harbor? It seemed strange and dangerous. In July 1941, the U.S. froze Japanese assets and announced a trade embargo. Japan found itself under threat of economic blockade. The response came quickly. Japanese envoys received telegrams marked strictly confidential, containing instructions to divide American cities and harbors into observation zones to send reports on ship movements. SIS and naval intelligence had already seen these messages. They understood. Diplomacy was fading into the background, and preparations for something larger were underway. Friedman didn't draw loud conclusions. He was a mathematician, not a politician. But in his personal journal, he wrote, "Tokyo increasingly speaks the language of intelligence, not diplomacy. This is not an exchange of notes. It's the positioning of pieces before a move." By autumn 1941, the decrypts grew more alarming. Japanese embassies around the world received identical instructions. Destroy outdated ciphers. Retain only current purple codes. Maintain full readiness for emergency messages from Tokyo. Such directives typically precede war. The Americans knew this, but here began a tragedy not of codes, but of people. The information gathered by Friedman and his team passed through many bureaucratic layers: the military, the State Department, Army intelligence, the Navy. There was no central body to collect and analyze everything as a whole. Each agency saw only a fragment of the picture. In early December, Washington received a message encrypted by purple, which, as later revealed, was the final warning. The Japanese embassy was instructed, "Deliver a note to the American government terminating negotiations. Present it on Sunday, precisely at 1:00 p.m. Washington time." Magic's decryptors decoded the text by the morning of December 7th. It meant diplomatic relations were severed, usually a precursor to military action. The summary was sent to Army and Navy leadership. But the communication system, burdened by the weekend, worked slowly. Telegrams were transmitted manually. Some were delayed in transit. The warning reached Hawaii too late. On December 7, 1941, at 7:55 a.m., Japanese planes attacked Pearl Harbor. Neither Friedman nor his colleagues could believe that the warning hidden in the codes hadn't saved lives. Purple had revealed the secret, but humanity hadn't read it in time. After the event, Friedman withdrew. He didn't blame anyone, but the quiet spark that always lit his eyes when solving problems had dimmed. In his report, he wrote, "We were able to hear the music of war, but we didn't manage to turn on the light." The paradox of purple was that it gave the U.S. one of the most powerful intelligence advantages of World War II, and yet didn't prevent its first catastrophe. After Pearl Harbor, Magic became a sacred project. From that moment on, Decrypts of Japanese messages were no longer postponed for later. Now every word from Tokyo was treated as a possible clue to future actions. After Pearl Harbor, America woke up. Just yesterday, the country had debated whether to enter someone else's war. Today, war was knocking at the door. Burning aircraft carriers, a smoking fleet, bewildered officers, all of it marked the beginning of a new era. But in the basements where decoding machines hummed, they knew. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor rose not only anger, but knowledge. Magic, a project born as a quiet experiment in Friedman's office, had now become the heart of American intelligence. Every intercepted Japanese dispatch became a tiny piece of the war map. And for the first time in history, wars were decided not only on the battlefield, but within the text. After the attack, Americans understood the next strike could come from anywhere. The fleet moved blindly across the Pacific, where every wave could conceal an enemy. But magic became the eye that saw farther than all others. In the spring of 1942, codebreakers began noticing strange codes in the Japanese radio network. Messages contained designations like AF, AO, AJ, not names, not cities, but mysterious two-letter markers. Analysts suspected the Japanese were encrypting geographic locations. But which ones? The Navy demanded answers. Where would they strike next? Then magic cryptographers, together with naval intelligence, devised a clever trick. From the American base on Midway Island, they sent an open message claiming the water desalination system was malfunctioning. Within a day, Japanese radio intercepts reported, AF is experiencing a shortage of fresh water. Magic decrypted the phrase, and everything became clear. AF meant Midway. The Japanese next target had been uncovered. The Battle of Midway became a turning point in the Pacific War. The Japanese fleet advanced, confident it would catch the Americans off guard. But the Americans already knew where and when the enemy would strike. On June 4, 1942, aircraft from the carriers Enterprise and Yorktown took to the skies at the exact moment Japanese decks were loaded with fuel-laden planes. It wasn't coincidence. It was the arithmetic of intelligence. Within hours, the Japanese lost 4 aircraft carriers, hundreds of planes, and their key to dominance in the ocean. A battle decided on paper and in radio waves became America's first major victory after Pearl Harbor. For the code breakers in Washington, it was a moment of quiet triumph. They weren't on the decks, didn't hear the thunder of anti-aircraft guns. And yet, they knew. It was their work that allowed the fleet to be in the right place at the right time. Friedman, observing the events, didn't speak grand words. He simply noted in a report, "The result is proof that 21st century war will be a war of signals." But victory brought a new wave of exhaustion. Magic operated around the clock. The decoding room resembled a hive. Every operator, every analyst was part of a vast network. Hundreds of intercepts per day. Dozens of codes that changed weekly. There was no room for error. The problem was that magic had become too important. Now everyone wanted access. The Army, the Navy, intelligence, the White House. But the more people knew about the project, the greater the risk of leaks. Magic documents were stored in safes with triple locks. Every report copy had a number, every page a return mark. Even President Roosevelt received summaries by hand against signature. The reports were written dryly, but between the lines, power pulsed. Magic source reports negotiations between Tokyo and Berlin. The Japanese embassy in Lisbon informs on Allied convoy movements. These short phrases shaped the strategy of war. American convoys changed routes, planes intercepted enemy ships, and somewhere in the darkness of the radio ether, Japanese operators continued transmitting their codes, unaware they were being read. For Friedman, it was a strange feeling. He had created a weapon that didn't kill, but decided the outcome of battles. His ghost machine had become the brain of the army. One day he told a colleague, "The hardest part isn't breaking the code. The hardest part is not losing your humanity when you realize you're reading someone else's thoughts." Friedman rarely left the building. Sometimes he was brought newspapers from the front, filled with stories of victories. But nowhere did they mention those behind the scenes. His name didn't appear in the news, but his equations saved ships. Soon, magic was used not only against Japan. Through it, Americans learned of Tokyo's negotiations with Berlin, resource shipments, and plans for Southeast Asia. This allowed the Allies to strengthen positions in Australia and the Philippines. The ghost machine, born of silence, now spoke louder than any gunshot. By mid-1943, the Magic Project had become something more than just a decoding operation. It had turned into the war's thinking center, a laboratory of ideas, hypotheses, and decisions that shaped actions on fronts the code breakers themselves didn't even know about. Every morning, new intercept tapes were brought into the basement of Arlington Hall. Hundreds of lines of letters, Japanese, German, neutral channels, all mixed into a single stream. Analysts called these tapes the nervous system of the empire. They pulsed like a living organism, the enemy's heartbeat, which could be heard if you knew where to place your ear. Magic now functioned not only as an intelligence tool, it had become a political advisor. When President Roosevelt prepared to meet with Churchill, he already knew what orders Tokyo was giving its envoys. When the Americans planned an offensive on the Solomon Islands, they understood how the Japanese fleet would respond. But with power came doubt. Some analysts began to feel strange. They were reading not only military orders, but personal letters, ambassadors' reports, private confessions, emotional reflections. Among the dry dispatches, there were sometimes lines like, "Please do not judge harshly if my actions seem indecisive. I serve the Emperor, but my heart is uneasy." A young codebreaker named Ruth Sheldon, one of Magic's top specialists, once said, "We see them in ways even their own government doesn't. Sometimes I catch myself feeling sympathy for them." Friedman nodded silently. He understood that the war of minds was not just mathematics. It was morality. Every decryption was, in essence, an intrusion into another soul. Meanwhile, competition between agencies in Washington was intensifying. The Army, Navy, State Department all demanded exclusive access to magic. Arguments broke out. Who had the right to read? Who could be trusted? Who should be briefed first? Sometimes crucial decrypts got lost in bureaucratic mazes. Friedman wrote in a memo to leadership, "A code is not just a set of symbols. It's a thought, and thought does not tolerate delay." But his voice was increasingly drowned in a sea of political intrigue. American intelligence was expanding. Departments, commissions, headquarters multiplied, and with them, the number of people eager to claim credit for success. Magic was so secret that even among the military, not everyone knew it existed. Messages were marked Top Secret Ultra. Documents were read in a single room and immediately returned to the safe. Even officers were forbidden from taking notes. The work was exhausting. the noise of machines, constant urgency, the awareness that any mistake could cost lives. Many magic staff suffered from insomnia. Some began drinking. Friedman understood that responsibility corrodes from within. He often said, "We've created an eye that sees everything, but no one taught us how to live with it." He began spending more time in silence, away from the bustle. In his journal, he wrote, "The machine now lives its own life. I am merely a shadow of its thought." And yet he continued, because he knew, as long as they read the codes, someone out there, on a ship or in the jungle, had a chance to survive. In the spring of 1944, magic played a key role in preparing the American offensive in the Philippines. Decrypts revealed that the Japanese had concentrated forces in the north, believing the attack would come from another direction. This intelligence allowed MacArthur to carry out a brilliant operation, the landing at Leyte. It was a moment when the war of minds turned into victory on the ground. When the first news of success arrived, Magic's staff didn't celebrate. They simply exchanged glances. Ruth Sheldon quietly said, "So we did something right." Friedman replied, "In this war, right is whatever helps end it." But deep down, he knew, no victory comes without a price. Every decrypted message was a trace in someone else's consciousness. Every solution was a step closer to becoming like those whose thoughts they read. Magic won many battles, but its creators began to lose their peace. In the autumn of 1944, Washington lived in two dimensions. Above, streets, parades, confidence in impending victory. Below, behind the heavy doors of Arlington Hall, a world where the sounds of war were absent, but its breath was felt in every decrypted line. Magic had become so vital that only a select few knew of its existence. At high command meetings, officers spoke of a special source, never naming it. Reports mentioned the dry phrase, "data confirmed." But behind it stood hundreds of eyes that hadn't seen daylight. Friedman, the man who had given America this weapon of reason, felt weary. He rarely left his office. Instead of daytime walks, endless rows of symbol-laden tapes. Instead of conversations, the rustle of punch cards and the quiet hum of machines. He began to understand that knowing everything was not a blessing, but a burden. Each morning, he received the magic summary. Dozens of messages, diplomatic cables, military instructions. Sometimes among them were lines that made him catch his breath. One day, a message from the Japanese foreign minister in Berlin. "If Germany falls, the empire will continue the war alone. We cannot afford surrender." Friedman, staring at the lines, thought, "We know they cannot win, but they don't know that. We see a future in which they've already lost." This realization was almost metaphysical. Magic had become a war oracle, revealing a future the enemy had yet to grasp. Gradually, Friedman began to notice troubling changes among his people. Some codebreakers no longer slept at night. Others began to question whether they should be reading everything they decrypted. Because now it wasn't just military codes, but reports of losses, diplomats' letters, messages about hunger, about fear. Ruth Sheldon once said, "We see their pain before they even speak of it. And then we read how they die." Those words stuck in Friedman's mind. He realized the war of minds doesn't erase suffering, it merely renders it silent. Meanwhile, Magic's successes grew more significant. In the spring of 1945, the project helped uncover Japanese diplomatic plans to mediate between Berlin and Moscow, giving the Allies insight into the enemy's desperation. Each new decrypt made it clearer. The end was near. But for Friedman, it wasn't joy. It was weight. He wrote in his notebook, "When a code becomes a cry, the mathematician becomes a witness." A few months before Japan's surrender, political debates began in Washington. Who would inherit magic after the war? The Army? The State Department? A new intelligence agency already whispered about in the corridors? Friedman, exhausted and graying, sat at a commission meeting, listening to generals argue over the future of what he had created. One of them said, "This is the greatest achievement of American science. We must preserve it at any cost." Friedman quietly replied, "Any cost? Sometimes I think we've already paid too much." After the war, when the smoke over the Pacific had cleared, magic became part of a new world, one of cold intelligence and endless surveillance. And for Friedman, silence arrived. His work became a state secret he couldn't speak of. He couldn't even tell his friends what he had done. He once told Ruth, "We won the war, but lost our peace." She smiled. "Then our job now is to teach the world to value silence while it still exists." When the war ended, many codebreakers left Arlington Hall. Some went into science, others into private companies. Magic remained, but under new names, with new machines, new ciphers, new secrets. One day, Friedman stood by a window and watched as the sign bearing his department's name was taken down. He said nothing, because he knew the real story always remains invisible. Magic became a symbol of that part of the war where there were no guns, but the fates of thousands were decided, where the weapon was not tanks, but thoughts, and where victory cost not blood, but silence.